The Venezuelan, also referred to as the Bolivarian Revolution, is very interesting to me. The main reason for that interest is that my church used to take a mission trip to Venezuela every year. I chose the book, The Venezuelan Revolution, 100 Questions, 100 Answers, by Chessie Baudin, Gabriel Gonzalez, and Wilmer Rumbos, mostly for its straightforward style. There are many questions I enjoyed reading about, but the 5 that follow I believe are very important to know. Who is Hugo Chavez? What is the political ideology underlying the Bolivarian revolutionary process? Are the changes in Venezuela truly revolutionary? What happened on April 11th and 12th of 2002? What are the future prospects for the Bolivarian Revolution? Answers to these questions in particular give the reader insight into the revolution and its impact on Venezuelan society. The opening question of the book is probably the most basic and fundamental of the entire book. Who is Hugo Chavez? The authors give Chavez's background in the answer to this question. He was born in 1954 in Barinas State. Both of his parents were school teachers who taught at schools a considerable distance from their home, so Chavez's grandmother actually had the biggest responsibility for raising him. The authors tell that Chavez actually had aspirations of becoming a professional baseball player. This dream was actually not too far-fetched, because it is around the 1970s that Major League Baseball in the United States began sending scouts into Latin America because of the wealth of talent that was being produced. Unfortunately for Chavez, his baseball career did not work out. He graduated from the Venezuelan Military Academy and then went on to be a grad student at Simón Bolívar University. In 1989, President Perez ordered the army to fire on unarmed civilians protesting his economic policies in what became known as a Caricazo. The result of this attack on Venezuelan citizens was a serious sense of unrest. The authors point out that after this incident, there were an average of 4.5 protests per day in Venezuela. In 1992, then Lieutenant Colonel Chavez led a coup to overtake President Perez's position. It was unsuccessful, but it did lay the foundation for Chavez's future in politics. He took the blame for the coup not working and took responsibility for his actions. He gained much national attention when he said "por ahora," or "the first time being." This statement was a true indicator of things to come, as after he served 2 years in prison, he began to collect support through the country and decided to run for the 1998 presidential election. Since then, Chavez has become the most popular figure in Venezuelan history. His speeches, the fact that he came from a working background, and his ability to present himself as somewhat of a champion of the poor is what makes Chavez so wildly popular. The second question, what is the political ideology underlying the Bolivarian revolutionary process, is critical to understanding Chavez's actions as president of Venezuela. The authors explain that the Bolivarian political process is based on the contributions of 3 men, Simon Bolivar, Ezequiel Zamora, and Simón Rodriguez. Bolivar, who the process was mostly attributed to, was a renowned military strategist and intellectual known in Venezuela as El Liberator. Under his command, his armies liberated Spanish-owned territory in Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, which was then named after Bolivar. He was also a well-known writer who covered many topics, including national sovereignty and unity. Zamora was a man of the poor. He carried out land reform movements in Venezuela in particular. Rodriguez was actually Bolivar's most influential tutor. Rodriguez strongly believed in a commitment to the concept of liberty. Most of Rodriguez's efforts were centered on improving the education in Venezuela. The ideas of these 3 men form what is known as the Bolivarian Revolution. Chavez uses these ideas to first get him into power and then to keep him in power. The authors also make note of a very interesting fact. Chavez's actions and thinking are also inspired by a very diverse group of historical figures that include Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Jesus Christ, and Karl Marx. The authors also say that Chavez describes himself as Christian, anti-imperialist, nationalist, and a leftist. Chavez's goal was not only to make Venezuela stronger, but to rid the entire world of perhaps its biggest enemy, which is poverty. Are the changes in Venezuela truly revolutionary? The authors and most Venezuelans would say yes. The authors note that a revolution is simply a time of rapid and profound change. However, whether or not the process can be labeled revolutionary or not depends on the situations that are in place before the time of change. The authors use an example of an agrarian society. When agricultural societies developed basic mechanized systems of production, an industrial revolution was on its way. Before Chavez took power in 1998, Venezuela had long ruled by a two-party representative democracy. Much of the government's attention was focused on the elite rather than the poor. Chavez has instituted the only true participatory democracy in the entire hemisphere. Every political action of the Bolivarian Revolution under Chavez has been voted on by the people of Venezuela. The Chavez administration has been very focused on bringing about social and economic change for the better in Venezuela. The authors conclude their answer by saying that most Venezuelans, whether they support them or oppose them, recognize that the profound changes that are currently in progress are indeed revolutionary. While Chavez's new government was revolutionary and had many supporters, it also had its share of enemies. In 2002, those enemies attempted to overthrow Chavez with a complex and well put together plan. Large opposition protests were formed on April 11th, and counter-protesters formed up in the same place, and as could be expected, the situation got intense. The purpose of all this was simply to isolate Chavez from his supporters by blaming the violence on him, which actually worked. The opposition wanted Chavez to resign, so Chavez said he would, but only on certain conditions, which included that no more people be harmed, the Constitution be upheld and the Vice President would take over, that he be able to address the nation live, and that his cabinet and bodyguards be able to accompany him. The opposition said no to this, and gave a deadline for Chavez to turn himself in by, or they would start bombing the palace, so Chavez cooperated, but without officially stepping down from his position. The next day, Pedro Carmona Estanja was sworn in as the new president. However, as the authors tell later in the book, Chavez was able to regain his power after the short-lived coup proved unsuccessful. The final question and answer segment of the book is perhaps the most important. What are the future prospects for the Bolivarian Revolution? While it is a tough question to answer since it is basically asking the authors to look into the future, the authors give a commendable effort. There are still obstacles to the revolution all across the country. However, it is still going strong and the approval ratings for Chavez have actually never been higher. The authors note that Chavez has said that the goals for the country could probably not all be accomplished before the year 2021, but that the country is already making serious strides towards these goals. The country is seeking to free itself of its historic dependence on the United States and is looking to create a more prosperous nation with alliances with other similar nations. In conclusion, the book, The Venezuelan Revolution, 100 Questions, 100 Answers, gives a good account of the background and the major issues of the Bolivarian Revolution. I really enjoyed the style of the book as it was very straightforward and easy to reference. The 5 questions that I chose to examine were ones that not only gave a good insight to the theory behind the revolution, but also the impacts on Venezuela of the revolution. Overall, this book was very good for giving a background and forming a foundation of understanding for Hugo Chavez, the Bolivarian Revolution, and the impacts on the people of Venezuela.